There's a specific kind of empath-avoidant men never fully recover from. Not the one who chases hardest. Not the one who tries longest, loves loudest, gives the most in hopes it will finally be enough to reach him. That empath, the one we've talked about before, the one whose effort meets his intermittent availability again and again, she's not the one this is about today. This is about someone entirely different. The empath who, at some point, stopped trying to earn access to an avoidant man's guarded heart, and in doing exactly that, became the only kind of woman his defenses were never actually built to withstand. This is the empath who brings avoidance to their knees, not through manipulation, not through games, through something far more disarming and far harder for him to explain even to himself. The simple, devastating experience of being genuinely, calmly loved by someone who was never actually asking anything of him in return. Let's understand why this specific type produces such a profoundly different effect than the pursuing empath does, because the mechanism reveals something crucial about avoidant psychology that most conversations about this attachment style never fully address. Remember what we've established across previous conversations about how avoidant attachment actually functions. His entire nervous system was trained, usually in early childhood, to associate closeness with danger, not danger in the dramatic sense, but the quieter, more corrosive danger of engulfment, of losing himself inside someone else's needs, of being required to provide emotional availability he never learned how to safely offer. This training doesn't just make him withdraw from intimacy. It makes him exquisitely, unconsciously skilled at detecting need in another person, because need is precisely what has always triggered his retreat. This is why the pursuing empath, however loving her intentions, inadvertently activates his defenses almost immediately. Her effort, her attentiveness, her hope for reciprocity all register, somewhere beneath his conscious awareness, as pressure, as exactly the kind of emotional requirement his nervous system learned long ago to escape. This isn't a judgment of her. It's simply how his particular wiring processes genuine investment from another person, regardless of how gently or patiently that investment gets offered. The empath who brings him to his knees operates from a completely different foundation, one that doesn't trigger this same defensive response, precisely because it doesn't ask anything of him at all. This empath has typically already done significant internal work, often through her own painful history, sometimes through exactly the kind of exhausting pursuit-based pattern we discussed in a previous conversation, before finally arriving somewhere fundamentally different. She has learned, usually the hard way, that her own wholeness cannot depend on someone else's capacity to meet her halfway. She has separated her own sense of worth completely from whether any particular person chooses to engage with her fully. And crucially, she has learned to love without the anxious undertow of need that avoidant partners are so remarkably skilled at detecting and retreating from. This doesn't mean she's emotionally distant or guarded in some cold, protective sense. Quite the opposite. She's often warmer, more genuinely present, more capable of real vulnerability than almost anyone he's ever encountered. But her warmth doesn't come with strings attached. Her presence doesn't require his reciprocation in order to remain stable. She can be fully, genuinely herself around him, interested, engaged, even affectionate, without any of it depending on whether he matches her energy, responds at her pace, or offers the specific kind of consistent availability she'd need if her own sense of security depended on receiving it from him. Here's what happens when an avoidant man encounters this specific quality, often for the first time in his adult life, and understanding this mechanism reveals exactly why it produces such a profound, disorienting effect. His entire defensive system was built to detect and retreat from need. When he encounters someone who genuinely doesn't need anything from him, who would be completely fine, genuinely, authentically fine, whether he engaged fully or pulled away entirely, his usual alarm system simply has nothing to register. There's no pressure to detect. There's no engulfment threat to retreat from. The exact mechanism that has protected him from every previous relationship's demands finds itself with nothing to defend against. This absence of pressure doesn't just fail to trigger his withdrawal, it does something far more disorienting. It removes the only framework he's ever had for understanding intimacy. Every previous experience of closeness has come paired with some degree of expectation, some implicit requirement that he perform availability in order to maintain the relationship's stability. This empath offers something his psychology has genuinely never encountered before: closeness without the corresponding demand, warmth without the anxious dependency that has always previously sent him running. And here's where the real disorientation begins. Because without the familiar pressure to retreat from, he's left facing something considerably more threatening than her need ever could have been: his own. For the first time, without her anxiety or pursuit to blame for the discomfort of intimacy, he's forced to confront whatever genuine desire for connection exists inside him independently, unmasked by the usual justification that he's simply protecting himself from someone else's excessive demands. This is precisely why this specific empath type produces an effect so different from anything the pursuing dynamic ever could. She doesn't chase him into vulnerability. She simply removes every reason he's ever had to avoid it, leaving him alone with his own genuine capacity for connection, something his defensive architecture was never actually built to face directly, without an external threat to blame it on. What actually happens once this dynamic is underway, because the way it unfolds reveals something crucial about why avoidant men so often become genuinely, visibly destabilized around this specific type of empath, in ways that eventually produce exactly the pursuit and vulnerability they've spent their entire lives avoiding. In the early stages of interacting with this empath, an avoidant man typically experiences something he doesn't have language for, precisely because it's so unfamiliar: comfort without threat. Most people, sensing his tendency toward withdrawal, either chase harder to compensate for it, which triggers his defenses, or match his distance defensively, which produces a kind of mutual coldness that never develops into genuine intimacy at all. This empath does neither. She remains warm, genuine, and present, entirely unaffected by whether he engages fully or retreats slightly, because her own emotional stability was never contingent on his behavior in the first place. This produces something remarkable, almost paradoxical, in how he experiences the relationship's early development, because she's not reacting to his withdrawal with either anxiety or matched coldness. His withdrawal simply doesn't produce the usual relief it typically provides. Normally, pulling back creates space, distance that soothes whatever discomfort intimacy was starting to trigger. With this empath, pulling back doesn't actually change anything about how she shows up, which means the relief he's used to experiencing from withdrawal simply isn't available in the same way. She's still there, still warm, still genuinely herself, regardless of his temporary distance, which removes the specific payoff his withdrawal pattern has always depended on to feel worthwhile. This absence of typical reward for withdrawal begins, slowly and often confusingly for him, to shift something in how he experiences the entire dynamic. Because if pulling back doesn't produce relief, and if her presence doesn't produce the usual pressure he's learned to associate with closeness, what exactly is he protecting himself from anymore? This question, rarely articulated consciously but genuinely felt at some deeper level, starts to erode the automatic quality his withdrawal pattern has always operated with throughout his previous relationships. Here's what typically happens next, and it's worth understanding in detail because it explains why this specific empath type so often ends up witnessing an avoidant man's genuine growth, even though she never actually pursued that growth as a goal in the first place. Without the usual justification for his withdrawal, her anxiety, her excessive need, her pressure for reassurance he can't authentically provide, he's left facing his own internal experience directly, often for the first time in a significant relationship. And what he typically discovers there, once the usual external justifications for distance have been removed, is something his defensive architecture worked very hard to keep him from ever having to face: genuine desire for exactly the kind of closeness he's spent his entire adult life avoiding. This discovery is genuinely disorienting, sometimes even frightening, precisely because it contradicts the story he's told himself about his own needs and preferences for years, sometimes decades. He's built an entire identity around being someone who values independence, who doesn't need excessive emotional intimacy, who functions better with space and autonomy than with the kind of closeness other people seem to crave. This empath's presence, precisely because it removes every external excuse for his distance, forces a direct confrontation with the possibility that this story was never entirely accurate, that some of his independence was never actually preference, but protection, built specifically to avoid feeling exactly what he's now, unexpectedly, starting to feel toward her. This is where the phrase brings avoidance to their knees actually earns its meaning. And it's worth understanding precisely why, because it's genuinely different from what that phrase might initially suggest. This isn't about her having power over him in some manipulative or even intentional sense. It's about the specific, disorienting experience of encountering someone whose lack of need forces him to finally encounter his own, someone whose stability reveals, by contrast, exactly how much of his previous independence was actually avoidance dressed up as genuine preference. Avoidant men who experience this specific dynamic often report, once enough time and genuine reflection have passed, a very particular kind of realization that they've never actually wanted distance for its own sake, that the distance was always protective rather than preferred, and that encountering someone who didn't require them to perform availability, who simply remained genuinely present regardless of their retreat, revealed a genuine capacity and even desire for closeness that years of avoidant patterning had successfully hidden from them, sometimes even from their own conscious awareness. This is precisely why this specific type of empath so often ends up being the person an avoidant man eventually pursues genuinely, sometimes for the first time in his life, chasing rather than being chased, initiating rather than merely responding to someone else's initiation. Because once his usual defensive architecture has been rendered irrelevant by her lack of pressure, once he's been forced to confront his own genuine desire rather than someone else's anxious need, the pursuit that emerges comes from an entirely different place than anything his previous relationships ever produced. It's not performance. It's not obligation. It's genuine, if often clumsy and uncertain, movement towards something he's finally allowed himself to want, rather than something he felt required to provide. But here's what's crucial to understand about this entire dynamic, something that prevents this conversation from becoming yet another version of the exhausting, hopeful waiting we've cautioned against throughout previous conversations about avoidant attachment. This outcome, however genuinely possible, was never actually the empath's goal in the first place. Because here's the crucial distinction that separates this specific empath type from someone simply performing detachment as a clever tactic to finally win an avoidant man's genuine pursuit. Her lack of need was never a strategy. It was never something she calculated, practiced, or deployed specifically to produce the effect we've spent this entire conversation describing. It was simply the authentic result of genuine internal work, done for her own sake, long before this particular avoidant man ever entered her life at all. This distinction matters enormously because it explains why attempting to copy this dynamic as a deliberate technique almost always fails, sometimes in ways that produce exactly the opposite of the intended result. If a woman consciously performs indifference, calculatedly withholds reaction, strategically manages her own visible investment, specifically in order to produce this exact effect on an avoidant partner, she's still operating from need. The need simply gets hidden rather than genuinely resolved. And avoidant men, precisely because their entire nervous system is finely tuned to detect exactly this kind of underlying anxiety, tend to sense the performance underneath the calculated calm, even when they can't consciously articulate what feels slightly off about it. This is worth stating directly and clearly because it's easy, after hearing everything we've discussed today, to walk away with a distorted, strategic interpretation. Pretend not to need him, and he'll finally chase you. This isn't what actually happened in the dynamic we've been describing, and attempting to manufacture it this way almost never produces the genuine transformation we've traced throughout this conversation. What actually produces this effect is considerably harder, considerably slower, and considerably more valuable than any strategy could ever be. Genuine, authentic wholeness, developed for its own sake, completely independent of whether it ever produces any particular reaction from any particular man at all. This is precisely why the empath who brings avoidance to their knees typically isn't even trying to. She's simply living her life, fully and authentically, according to her own values and her own genuine sense of security, built through whatever combination of healing, self-work, and hard-won experience brought her to this specific place. The effect on avoidant men she encounters is a byproduct of this genuine wholeness, not its purpose. And this distinction matters enormously for anyone hoping to eventually experience this same dynamic in her own life, because it means the actual work required has almost nothing to do with managing an avoidant partner's specific reactions, and everything to do with the same internal development we discussed at length in our previous conversation about breaking the pattern of chasing avoidant partners in the first place. There's something else worth understanding about this dynamic, something that provides important balance to everything we've discussed today. Even when this specific transformation does occur, even when an avoidant man genuinely moves from withdrawal into authentic pursuit, into genuine vulnerability he's never before offered anyone, this doesn't guarantee a smooth, permanent, fully healed relationship free from any further difficulty. Avoidant attachment patterns, developed over decades, rarely resolve completely through a single relationship, however genuinely transformative that relationship might be. This empath's presence might genuinely crack open something significant in him, might genuinely reveal capacities he never knew he possessed. But the underlying attachment pattern, the years of conditioning that built his defensive architecture in the first place, typically requires more than one relationship, however powerful, to fully, permanently resolve. This means the empath who experiences this dynamic should hold it with appropriate realism rather than fairy tale expectation. His genuine movement toward her doesn't necessarily mean every future difficulty has been permanently solved. It means something real and significant has shifted, something worth taking seriously and building upon, but not necessarily something that guarantees an effortless relationship free from any further oscillation between closeness and retreat, particularly during periods of genuine stress or heightened vulnerability, where old patterns are always most likely to resurface. Here's what ultimately matters most about understanding this entire dynamic, though, and it brings us back to something we've emphasized throughout many of these conversations. This empath's power was never actually about him at all. It was never built specifically to unlock his capacity for love, however genuinely beautiful it might be when that unlocking does occur. It was built for her own sake, her own healing, her own genuine freedom from needing any particular outcome from any particular relationship in order to feel secure in her own worth. This is precisely why she remains completely whole regardless of which direction things eventually go. If he does move toward genuine vulnerability, genuine pursuit, genuine partnership, she receives this as a genuine gift, built on authentic connection rather than desperate hope. And if he doesn't, if his defensive architecture proves too deeply entrenched even in the face of her genuine pressure-free presence, she remains exactly as whole, exactly as secure, exactly as fundamentally unshaken as she was before he ever entered her life at all, precisely because her sense of worth was never actually built on his response in the first place. This is the real secret behind why this specific empath type produces such a profound effect on avoidant men, one that has nothing to do with strategy, nothing to do with calculated withholding, and everything to do with genuine hard-won wholeness that exists completely independent of any particular relationship's outcome. She doesn't bring him to his knees through withholding love. She does it, if it happens at all, simply by loving fully, genuinely, and completely, without ever once requiring him to earn that love, match it, or reciprocate it in order for her to remain exactly fully herself. That kind of love, offered without need, without agenda, without anxious dependency attached to its outcome, turns out to be the one thing an avoidant man's defenses were never actually built to withstand. Not because it demanded anything from him, but because for the first time it demanded absolutely nothing at all.